Hi, welcome back. In section 3, 4 and 5 of his essay on the enchantment of the state, Kaviraj examines three intellectual positions on the nature and role of modern state. The first position was relating to a major strand of theoretical reflection that emerged in Bengal in the 1860s in the work of Bengal authors, among whom Bhudev Mukhopadhyay's essays on sociology, which in Kaviraj's opinion were the most insightful and consistent. Interestingly, Kaviraj gives a great length of space in this essay to discuss the ideas of Bhudev Mukhopadhyay. He justifies his action on two grounds. First, he opines that in historiography of Indian intellectual modernity, vernacular reflection has been relatively neglected in favor of authors who wrote in English. However, the ideas of English writers were often derived from strands of reasoning which were already powerfully articulated in the vernacular discourse. In some ways, vernacular critical thought was in fact more original and more uncompromising towards Western reasoning than what appeared in English. Second, a discussion of Bhudev shows that Gandhi's astounding interventions on the question of modernity and the state had a long indigenous pan-Indian history. Kaviraj's examination of Bhudev's ideas can be discussed in 5 points. Let's take up these points one after the other. The first point relating to the internal sovereignty. In one of his essays, Bhudev examines the Indian and European societies comparatively. While doing so, Bhudev builds an unappealing Hobbesian picture of modern European society, and thereby he points out the differences between two societies. Bhudev argues that the Indian and European societies were providentially joined by history. Beyond this, they do not share anything in common. They both operate on different principles and norms. Modern European societies transferred their internal sovereignty to a state which then assumed legitimate external authority. Such external authority enables state to provide societies and communities with their normative and practical order. However, the Indian society by which Bhudev primarily meant the Hindu social order was based on caste and ran according to its normative internal principles. These normative principles are derived from a collectively accepted and intelligible order of dharma. In short, the Hindu society is ran in accordance with its internal principles. Therefore, external interference into the settled habits of Hindu society was unjustified, and for this reason likely to be ineffectual if there is any forceful attempt by the authority of the state to change its interior organization. By arguing so, Bhudev was rejecting any sort of interference by the colonial rulers in the social universe of the Indians. And by doing so, Bhudev was disqualifying the claims of internal sovereignty of the modern state. Secondly, Bhudev points out how the new social norms of European societies force them into a war of all against all. The modern European societies are built on a new kind of acquisitiveness, material greed, and expansion of individuality. That is, individual and his rights and liberties have come to acquire a central concern and importance. Bhudev argues that when we judge the material greed and expansion of individuality from a rationalistic humanist perspective, one comes to realize that these have three negative effects. First, it destroyed the unconditional affection which traditionally held families together. Secondly, it has introduced forces that were bound to turn family, the basic social unit, into an increasingly contractual institution. And finally, it has turned the world of work, the field of interaction between productive persons, into a field of continuous conflict, a war of all against all. Third, Bhudev was not convinced by the European idea of state as an agency that can eliminate the conflict. In dialogue with Thomas Hobbes' theory of sovereignty, Bhudev argues that Hobbes' solution of creating a sovereign is an act of mistake, because that solution neither reduces nor eliminates the perpetual conflicts that the European society is involved in. The Hobbesian solution is ineffective simply because competition and conflicts are at the base of the European societies. Fourth, taking this opinion of modern European societies as written with conflict and competition, Bhudev argues that European societies, through their colonialism, taking conflicts and competition to the level of world society. Now that European societies had the collective power to extend their views and modes of living to all others, they are imposing those norms artificially on all their colonized societies. Although such imposition is being justified on the grounds of universal nature of human behavior and character and the modernization of underdeveloped societies, according to Bhudev, it's important to recognize that modernity in the colonized societies has emerged not through spontaneous internal efforts, but by the forcible reforms of an external agency. That is the European colonial rule. Fifth, while pointing out the negative impact upon the colonized societies due to the imposition of modernity, Bhudev argues that through the modern states, which were exceptional devices in the history of the colonized societies, the European imperialism restructured the entire social universe in the colonies into a form of society that was excessively materialistic, individualistic and competitive, and which eventually made any real conception of community unsustainable. One could clearly see that Bhudev was assessing the impact of the colonial rule on the social universe of the colonized societies through a certain moral lenses. 2 points from Bhudev's assessment are noteworthy. First, as the very conception of community becomes unsustainable, society would eventually undermine its own bonds of basic sociality by encouraging individuals to treat all others instrumentally. As a result, both collective and individual life shall become unfulfilling. Second, states based on these forms of competitive sociality would reproduce similar relations of hostility and competition towards other states, which would lead to interminable wars among nation states. After a close inspection, Bhudev rejected the Western proposal of modernity on 4 fundamental grounds. Firstly, capitalist modernity exhausted the emotional bonds within the family by making them illegitimately contractual. Secondly, capitalist economies destroyed all sense of community by rendering human relations competitive and aggressive. Thirdly, modern states were primarily effective engines of comprehensive wars against other states. And finally, the search for self-interest by states drove modern European nations into a denial of self-determination for others. But they valued the same self-determination for themselves, thereby justifying modern imperialism. Interestingly, although Boudiaf was sharply critical of modern European statecraft, he showed deep admiration for two achievements of European modernity: political economy, the European science of improving the wealth of nations, and the growth of modern science. Apart from these two spheres, in Boudiaf's opinion, Indian society had nothing to learn from Europe. Undoubtedly, Boudiaf places most powerful and complex arguments against Western modernity and colonialism. Yet, his reflections on the modern state remained fatally incomplete simply on account of lack of suggestions for strategic opposition. He had no answer to its power except for refined disapproval. Without a counter-strategy, as Kaviraj argued, Boudiaf's response to colonialism was simply a technique of crafty civility, accepting British rule as providentially given while waiting for some future fundamental changes in the field of political power. Now, let's take up the fourth section, the discourse of disillusion of Gandhi. While discussing about Boudiaf's critique of European colonialism and modernity, we noted that despite his powerful critique against Western modernity and European statecraft, he showed deep admiration for two achievements of the European modernity: political economy, the European science of improving the wealth of nations, and the growth of modern science. But Gandhi does not want to give even those two concessions to the European modernity. He has rejected the idea of European modernity completely. But how did Gandhi make sense of his rejection of modernity, and what are his ideas and arguments? In his rejection of the Western modernity, Gandhi rather powerfully deployed two indigenous concepts, Swaraj and Himsa, or violence. Gandhi believed that the primary principle of human life was restraint, Swaraj. Swaraj usually means rule by the self, taking this in the direction of political autonomy. But it also means rule over the self, Swa and Raj. The second concept is Himsa, or violence. This concept has been deeply embedded in reformistic traditions of Indic religion, in Buddhism, Jainism, and all versions of the Vaishnava sects. Gandhi deployed the concept of violence most innovatively and in a complex, vastly capacious sense, which could extend from personal jealousy against others to meat eating, the ill treatment of animals, aggressive behavior in market society, modern wars which extended the full capacity of modern science and technology towards a rationalist project of destruction against other states and people. As Kaviraj pointed out, Gandhi, by outlining the ramifications of this concept, of the concept of violence, believed that he could bring the entire architecture of European modernity, that is the ideas and the claims of the European modernity, into a single intelligible theoretical grid, and in a manner that would be entirely persuasive to religious-minded Indians. For Gandhi, a central and normative ideal common to all the pre-modern civilization was Swaraj, restraint. Incidentally, the idea of Swaraj is one of the dominant themes of reflection in the Indic religions on the government of the self, particularly sensual desires. In Gandhi's hand, the idea of Swaraj taken a fine shape, particularly the way in which Gandhi inverses the relation between internal and external government. If the individual could restrain himself and control his desires, especially his material desires, he would find satisfaction or contentment and therefore require less external control. The extent of intrusion of the state in the lives of individuals and local communities was directly proportional to their failure to exercise self-restraint. Now, if we can closely observe Gandhi's idea of internal government, we will find that it is closely connected with Bhudev's argument that traditional Indian society was ruled from inside. Although Kaviraj did not say this, but in my opinion, both Gandhi's idea of internal government and Bhudev's idea of rule from inside are directly drawing from Manu's theory of kingship. The society shall be ruled or governed not by the rules of the king, but by the abstract principles of the danda, which is nothing but the social order, which of course nothing but varnashrama dharma. I think Kaviraj's love for Gandhi might have blinded him to see beyond Bhudev and the intimacy that Gandhi's internal government shares with Manu's idea of the danda. That aside, we see that it is with this grand idea of Swaraj or restraint that Gandhi is set to attack the European modernity. According to Gandhi, the European culture was undergoing a major predicament or difficult situation. Such difficult situation arose not because of some external hand, but simply on account of its own accord. The European modernity has turned human ideals upside down, particularly it has reversed the ideal of restraint. Now the fulfilling of human life is not in restraining one's desires, but in realizing them. In a way, abandoning the ideal of restraint itself has become the ideal of human life in the European societies. In other words, the major predicament of the European culture is on account of its substitution of the traditional principles of moral restraint in the desires of the individual and in the economic acquisitiveness of society. One major consequence of the excessive individual freedom and lack of restraint is the disturbance in social order. Now, in order to discipline or produce social order, the European culture is increasingly forced to depend exclusively on the external powers of the state. In a way, as individual acquisitiveness is encouraged and crosses all traditional restraint, the ordering powers of the state have to expand to impose legal prohibitions. Gandhi points out a deep connection between two parallel developments in Western modernity: liberal ideals of individual freedom and powers of the state. The expansion of liberal ideals of individual freedom resulted in the increase of the power of the state. That is, the more the autonomy of individual is encouraged by the modern social imaginary to invade others' interests, the more the state would be called upon to restrain and mediate between them. Gandhi also argues that the enslavement of the individual to his or her own desires leads necessarily to the enslavement of societies to their states and ruling mechanisms of an external institutional order. Following from Gandhi's own argument, it's clear that Gandhi's theory of the state had two defining characteristics. First, acceptance in a social order, which was supposedly a divinely given one. By accepting so, Gandhi's theory reduced the function of the state to the merest preservation of that order. Secondly, it also wants the state to be a minimal one. Minimal not in the sense of laissez-faire liberalism, but in the sense of pre-modern way. Having said that, we must note that Gandhi's theory of government of the self and government of societies. Excuse me. Nana, 1 minute. 1 minute. That was my son. So we must note that Gandhi's theory of government of the self and government of societies failed to answer several questions. For instance, it was true that the powers of the modern state were so vast and intrusive that individual disobedience to this state was ineffectual. Therefore, the only form of resistance to the power of the modern state was another typically modern form of collective agency, the political mass movement. This means replacing the British colonial state with the political mass movement by the Indians. However, Gandhi's thinking had no simple answer to the question of how to practically evict the power of the state from Indian society once British colonialism was removed. Kaviraj notes that Gandhi's conservative idea of state was eventually to become a failed one due to 3 reasons. First, the modern form of the state was attractive to modern elites because they saw in it an immensely usefulness for the expansion of their own power over society. The modern elites were not satisfied with the segmentary forms of domination. Only the mediation of the modern state could provide the required domination for them over the masses. Second, subaltern groups in Indian society, particularly the lower castes and untouchables and also the working class parties, saw in the modern state the only instrumentality which could provide them with some reasonable chance of emancipation from traditional subordination to social elites. Finally, for the political and intellectual elites, it has become clear that the international order was irreversibly an order of states, and no national group could exist viably without employing this transactively mandatory form of political association. Thus, from these 3 reasons, one could say that the historical conservatism found in Bhudev and Gandhi offered a powerful critique but could not stop the irresistible march of the modern state. I shall end here. In the next clip, the final section will discuss the final section from Kaviraj's essay on the enchantment of the state. Thank you.